You know, usually when you picture a bank vault, there's a very clear expectation of like what it's supposed to do, right? You picture the foot-thick steel door, the complex time locks, the laser grid.
Right, yeah.
The entire architectural purpose is to keep the bad guys out and protect what's inside. I mean, it is a structure built entirely for security.
Yeah, exactly. It's designed to be an impenetrable barrier against theft. That is its defining characteristic, the reason it exists in the first place.
But imagine for a second that an architect builds a vault that looks perfect from the outside. Like, it has the heavy door, it has the spinning dials, the flashing alarm lights.
Okay.
But secretly, the internal locking mechanism is designed so that the bank managers themselves can easily siphon the cash out the back door.
Oh, wow.
Right. And while they're doing this, the alarm system is simultaneously broadcasting to the public that everything is perfectly safe.
That's incredibly cynical.
It is. It's this illusion of security that doesn't just fail to stop the theft, it actually facilitates it by keeping everyone calm while the robbery is happening.
I mean, it is the absolute definition of a counterfeit structure.
Hmm.
The form of protection is there, but the function has been completely inverted.
And that illusion of security, that architectural counterfeit, is exactly what is happening in global politics right now.
Hmm.
Today, we are looking at a massive structural puzzle, and it's this. Why do some of the most corrupt extractive regimes in the post-Soviet world spend so much time and money passing, shiny new constitutions, staging elaborate elections, and talking endlessly about the rule of law?
Right, because why bother?
Exactly. I mean, if you are an autocrat or a predatory elite, why do it? Why not just rule with an iron fist, save the money on the fake elections, and take what you want?
Yeah, we tend to assume that when a regime uses the vocabulary of democracy but acts like a kleptocracy, it is just standard hypocrisy. Or perhaps we view it as a transition lag, the idea that they're genuinely trying to be a democracy, but they are just immature, not very good at it yet, and they just need more time to build those institutions.
But the source material we are unpacking today argues something entirely different.
It really does.
Our mission in this deep dive is to explore a really fascinating academic paper. It's titled Counterfeit Concepts as Rent Protection: The Stationary Bandit, Semantic Capture, and the Instrumental Use of Democracy and the Rule of Law in Post-Soviet Ukraine.
It's a mouthful of a title for sure.
It is, yeah. But the authors of this paper present a framework suggesting that this behavior is not hypocrisy. It is not a clumsy, lagging transition. It is a highly calculated, incredibly efficient technology of theft.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that they argue it is an equilibrium. It is a system working flawlessly to maximize the extraction of wealth while minimizing the cost to the people doing the extracting. It asks us to look at the words we use to hold power, accountable words like democracy, and recognize that they can be weaponized to actually protect the elites from that very accountability.
Now, before we really get into the mechanics of this, I do want to add a quick note for you listening. Our source today deals with some highly sensitive political topics.
Right.
It's specifically analyzing post-Soviet governance and the political history of Ukraine from 1991 to 2026. And in this deep dive, we are remaining strictly neutral.
Absolutely.
Our goal is not to take a side, endorse a specific political viewpoint, or, pass judgment on the political actors involved. We are simply here to impartially unpack the profound analytical framework that the authors present.
Yeah, we're just looking at the mechanics of the theory.
Exactly. The goal is to give you these mental models so you can apply them to your own understanding of global politics, wherever you might be looking.
Because, I mean, we almost universally view democracy and the rule of law as the ultimate constraints on bad leadership.
Right, they're the good things.
Yeah, they are the mechanisms of accountability. To understand how they get flipped into shields for corruption, we really have to strip away the ideology entirely.
Okay, so where do we start?
We have to look at the cold, hard math of taking people's money.
I love that. Let's get into the math of theft.
So to do that, the authors start by taking us back to a classic theory in political economy developed by Mancur Olson. It's all about bandits.
Let's lay the groundwork there. We're talking about a distinction Olson drew between two types of predators, right? The roving bandit and the stationary bandit.
That's the one.
Set the scene for us. What does the roving bandit look like in practice?
Picture a marauding warlord or an invading army from antiquity moving rapidly through a territory. A roving bandit has absolutely no long-term stake in the land or the people living on it. Because they are constantly on the move, their economic incentive is to steal absolutely everything that is portable and valuable.
Just take it all.
Right. They will take the entire harvest, steal the livestock, conscript the young men, and often just burn down the village on their way out. It is an exercise in pure, unadulterated extraction.
And crucially, that method destroys the future productive capacity of the victims.
Yes, exactly. The roving bandit does not care if the farmers starve to death next winter.
Because they won't be there.
Precisely. By next winter, the bandit will be 1,000 miles away, raiding a completely different province. Their time horizon is extremely short, so their rate of extraction is, well, 100%.
Pure smash and grab. So how does the behavior change when that marauder decides to, become a stationary bandit?
Well, eventually, a roving bandit might realize that moving around constantly, fighting new battles every single day, is exhausting.
And probably highly inefficient.
Very inefficient. So they decide to settle down. They conquer a specific territory, they establish a monopoly on violence in that area, and they actively keep all the other roving bandits out.
So they become the state, essentially.
They effectively become a dictator, a king, or an autocrat. But the moment they settle down and tie themselves to a specific geography, their economic incentives undergo a radical transformation.
How so?
They develop what Olson called an encompassing interest in the population's productivity.
Because if they are staying in one place permanently, their future wealth is now entirely dependent on the future wealth of the people they are robbing.
Exactly. If the stationary bandit takes 100% of the crops this year, the farmers will starve, the fields will go unplanted, and the bandit will have absolutely nothing to steal next year.
Oh.
Purely out of selfish calculation, the stationary bandit realizes they have to limit their theft. They rationally dial back their rate of extraction to whatever percentage maximizes their long-term continuous revenue.
It reminds me of the difference between a burglar who breaks into your bakery, smashes the display cases, empties the register, and leaves the place in ruins.
Right, the roving bandit.
Yeah, versus a local mafia boss running a protection racket in your neighborhood.
That's a great analogy.
The burglar destroys your livelihood. But the mafia boss actually wants your bakery to thrive, right? They want you to sell more bread and expand to a second location so that he can keep collecting his envelope of cash every single week and maybe a thicker envelope next year.
That is a very accurate way to think about it.
Yeah.
Olson referred to this phenomenon as the first blessing of the invisible hand.
First blessing. That sounds very benevolent for a mob boss.
It is a deeply paradoxical idea, for sure. The pure self-interest of the thief actually leads them to provide genuine public goods to their victims.
But wait, I want to push back on that for a second.
Sure.
Let's say I am this mafia boss or this stationary autocrat. I have the guns. I have the power. If my ultimate goal is still just to extract wealth from the population, why would I spend my own stolen money building roads or schools or hospitals? Why provide public goods at all?
You do it because our richer, healthier, more productive population means a dramatically larger tax base for you to extract from. If you, as the dictator, build a safe paved road, the farmers can transport twice as many goods to the market in half the time. They make significantly more money, and therefore you can take a much larger absolute cut.
So it pays for itself.
Exactly. If you provide basic physical security so people aren't afraid of being murdered in the street, they are more willing to open businesses, work hard, and invest in their own futures. That grows the overall economic pie.
Okay.
The stationary bandit provides genuine public goods, infrastructure, security, a functioning basic court system for contract disputes, not out of benevolence or kindness, but strictly because the marginal contribution of those goods to the tax base exceeds the cost of providing them.
It is a capital investment in their own extraction machinery. They are fertilizing the soil so they can harvest a larger crop later.
And this leads us to a second, deeply important implication from Olson's theory, which the authors of our source really emphasize. For the stationary bandit, political legitimacy is not a moral imperative.
What is it then?
It is strictly an economic variable.
How does a dictator view legitimacy as, like, a line item on a budget?
Think about it. Ruling a population through pure, naked coercion is incredibly expensive.
Oh, because of the enforcement costs.
Yeah. If people obey you only because you have a gun to their head, you have to buy a lot of guns. You have to pay an enormous standing army. You have to build endless networks of prisons. You have to employ a massive secret police force to monitor everyone constantly.
That eats into the profit margins.
Huge drain on the treasury. The authors draw on the foundational sociology of Max Weber, to point out that dural domination always seeks to cultivate a belief in its own legitimacy.
Okay, so getting people to buy in.
If the population genuinely believes the ruler is legitimate, maybe they believe the ruler has a divine right, or is protecting them from a worse fate, they comply voluntarily.
And voluntary compliance is essentially free.
It is the ultimate cost-saving measure. Voluntary compliance is a direct substitute for costly coercion. Legitimation is almost always the cheapest pillar of autocratic stability.
So, to synthesize this baseline theory, a secure autocrat, the perfect stationary bandit, will actually govern somewhat reasonably.
Correct.
They will build infrastructure, provide basic security, and try to appear legitimate to the public, all to grow the overall tax base so they can skim a larger fortune off the top over the next 30 years.
That is the classical expectation, yes.
But as our deep dive focuses on the post-Soviet space in the decades following 1991, we didn't exactly witness a sudden proliferation of, benevolent stationary bandits building pristine roads and investing heavily in the broad public good.
No, we certainly did not.
If the economic theory says stationary bandits are supposed to eventually provide these things to maximize their own revenue, why did that fail to materialize in this specific region?
This is where the paper introduces a critical modification to the classical theory. The authors argue that the elites in the post-Soviet space simply do not fit Olson's ideal model.
How so?
They are what the paper terms defective stationary bandits.
Defective, meaning the mechanism that forces them to care about the public is broken somehow?
Yes. They completely lack the secure, encompassing interest that forces the classic bandit to nurture the broader public. The authors identify 3 specific fatal flaws in the post-Soviet elite structure that make them defective.
Okay, let's explore those flaws, because Olson's theory assumes the dictator feels completely secure, right? Like they are a king who is going to rule for 40 years and then pass the kingdom down to their children.
Right.
What happens if this elite knows they might get ousted in the next election cycle or overthrown by a rival oligarch?
That is exactly the first flaw. The elite in this context is not a single secure monopolist. Instead, they operate in a system of patronal pluralism.
Patronal pluralism. What does that actually look like on the ground?
It means the elite is actually fractured into competing factions. You can think of them as extended patron-client pyramids, massive networks of politicians, businessmen, and security officials, all aggressively fighting each other for control of the state's distributed machinery.
So instead of one undisputed mafia boss running the entire city, you have like 5 different mafia families engaged in a perpetual turf war, constantly fighting over the same territory and resources.
And because no single faction has a permanent, secure hold on power, their time horizons shrink dramatically.
Oh.
They know their window of access to the state treasury might slam shut at any moment if a rival faction outmaneuvers them or wins an election.
So they can't plan for 30 years out.
Exactly.
Yep.
Consequently, within this nominally stationary recognized state, these competing factions actually revert to the behavioral incentives of a roving bandit.
Wow. So they just start looting again.
They grab whatever they can, as fast as they can, before they lose power.
It is a smash and grab operation conducted from inside the palace. I mean, if you think you might be living in exile next year, you are certainly not going to authorize a 10-year infrastructure project to improve crop yields.
No, absolutely not.
You are going to loot the central bank today and offshore the money as fast as possible.
That lack of security destroys the incentive to build. And that brings us to the second flaw, which relates to the actual source of their wealth.
Okay, where are they getting the money?
It's about the nature of asset-specific rents. Olson's classic stationary bandit acts like a king taxing millions of peasant farmers.
Right.
To get rich, the king needs all of those farmers to be slightly richer. The king's personal wealth is inextricably tied to the broad prosperity of the whole country.
They need a broad tax base.
Yes, but post-Soviet elites generally do not make their fortunes from a broad, general tax base.
Where does the money come from then, if not from taxing the general public?
They make their money from capturing and monopolizing specific, highly concentrated choke points in the economy.
Choke points? Like what?
This could look like gaining control over the single natural gas pipeline that transits through the country. It could be controlling the state licensing board for all major lucrative exports. Or it could be monopolizing a specific extractive heavy industry like metallurgy or coal mining.
Oh, I see the disconnect. If your entire multi-billion-dollar fortune comes entirely from skimming transit fees off a massive gas pipeline, you really do not care if the small business owners in the capital city are thriving.
Not at all.
You don't care if the tech sector is growing or if local bakeries are turning a profit. Your wealth is entirely decoupled from the general prosperity of the population. You just need the pipeline to keep flowing.
And you will use your political power exclusively to protect that specific asset,
Yeah.
often at the expense of everyone else.
Right.
It is a textbook example of a distributional coalition. This is a narrow, powerful group that captures highly concentrated financial benefits for themselves, while dispersing the costs and the economic damage across the rest of society.
Yeah.
Their encompassing interest in the broader public good is practically zero.
I am picturing a corporate raider who takes over a struggling manufacturing company.
Yes, perfect analogy.
They don't come in with a 20-year plan to build a better product or invest in research and development or, improve employee morale to grow the stock price naturally.
No, they come in to strip the assets.
Exactly. They want to sell the prime real estate the factory sits on, liquidate the employee pension fund, sell the very copper wire out of the walls, and just parachute out with a massive payout. They don't care if the company goes bankrupt tomorrow because their profit is tied to selling off specific assets, not the long-term health of the enterprise.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. They are extracting value while hollowing out the structure itself.
Okay, so that's two flaws. What's the third?
The third fatal flaw of the defective stationary bandit explains why they are allowed to get away with this asset stripping. It has to do with the stark asymmetry in organization between the elite and the general public.
Okay, yeah. Why doesn't the public just stop them? If a small group of people is visibly looting the country's wealth, why don't millions of citizens just organize and vote them out or protest until the system changes?
To explain this, the authors return to Olson's work, specifically his foundational logic of collective action.
Okay.
Olson demonstrated mathematically that large, diffuse groups, like the general public of an entire nation, face massive, almost insurmountable hurdles in organizing themselves to achieve a shared goal.
This is the free rider problem, right? Where everyone wants the benefit, but nobody wants to actually pay the cost.
Yes, exactly. Think about what it actually takes for an average citizen to fight for honest governance in a deeply corrupt system.
A lot of effort.
It requires dedicating years of your life, spending your own money, enduring exhaustion, and often facing severe physical danger or legal harassment from the state.
Yeah, the risks are huge.
And if you somehow succeed against all odds and establish a clean, transparent government, everybody in the country gets to enjoy that honest governance, including the millions of people who stayed home on their couches and did absolutely nothing to help you.
The rational, self-interested choice for any individual citizen is to let someone else take the risk. You just stay quiet, focus on your own family, and hope a hero comes along to fix the system.
Right. But because millions of people are making that exact same rational calculation, the public remains passive.
Everyone is waiting for someone else to move first.
However, the elites do not face this collective action problem at all.
Why not?
They are a very small, highly concentrated group of individuals fighting for massive, easily divisible financial rewards. If 5 oligarchs can collude to win control of the state energy monopoly, they each become billionaires overnight.
So the incentive is just overwhelming.
The payoff is so concentrated and so massive that they organize effortlessly. They form tight-knit financial industrial groups, they hire armies of lawyers, they buy media networks, they are highly mobilized.
So we have this profound mismatch. The defective stationary bandit faces a public that is structurally disorganized and diffuse, while the bandit itself is a hyper-organized syndicate.
That is the trifecta of the defective bandit. Competing factions with short time horizons, extracting wealth from specific choke points rather than general taxation, and operating against a disorganized public.
But I mean, there is an inherent tension here. Even a highly disorganized public has a breaking point, don't they?
They do.
If you act like that corporate raider and strip the copper wire out of the walls for long enough, eventually the people are going to realize the building is collapsing around them. Eventually, they will starve and they will revolt. And as we established earlier, putting down a mass revolt with pure military force is incredibly expensive.
It destroys the profit margin.
Exactly. So how does this defective stationary bandit keep the public pacified and compliant without spending a fortune on violence?
This is where the framework makes a brilliant pivot from political economics to linguistics.
Linguistics. Okay, how does that work?
To keep the extraction going at the absolute lowest possible cost, The elite deploys a weaponized vocabulary. They pursue the ultimate political prize, the capture of essentially contested concepts.
I want to break down that term carefully. Essentially contested concepts. What makes a word essentially contested as opposed to just a regular word?
Well, in 1956, a philosopher introduced this idea to highlight that certain words are fundamentally different from standard vocabulary. If you and I disagree about what a triangle is, we can simply open a geometry textbook, look up the mathematical definition, and settle the argument objectively.
No three sides, done.
The definition is fixed. But words like art or social justice, or crucially for our discussion, democracy and the rule of law, do not have a single, objective, universally agreed upon definition.
Because what constitutes true democracy is highly subjective.
Exactly.
You might think democracy just means holding a vote every 4 years. I might argue that without robust protections for minority rights and a free press, a vote is meaningless, so your version isn't a real democracy.
Right. And someone else might argue that true democracy requires economic equality, not just political equality. We could debate it for centuries and never find an objective answer in a dictionary.
And that is the crucial vulnerability. Because these words are internally complex, heavily value-laden, and their meaning is permanently open to interpretation, it means their meaning is capturable.
Precisely. If a concept doesn't have a fixed anchor, then whoever has the loudest megaphone, whoever controls the public arena and the institutions, gets to dictate what that word means in practice.
Okay, but why those specific words? Why democracy?
The incentive to capture the meaning of democracy and the rule of law is astronomical. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, those two specific terms achieved total normative hegemony across the globe.
They became the gold standard.
They became the only universally acceptable currency for political legitimacy. You literally cannot function on the global stage without that vocabulary anymore.
Right, you can't stand at the podium at the United Nations and declare, I rule this country by the divine right of kings, or I rule because my military is the most ruthless.
You will be ostracized immediately.
You have to say, I rule because I am a democratically elected leader upholding the strict rule of law. Even the most brutal totalitarian dictatorships in the world now hold elections and write constitutions because they desperately need to use the vocabulary.
Which brings us to the core mechanism articulated in the paper, semantic capture.
Semantic capture, okay.
This draws heavily on the tradition of George Orwell. Orwell wrote extensively about the deliberate deformation of political language. He warned about how words can be intentionally severed from their actual real-world reference until they mean their exact opposite.
War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength.
The classic doublespeak.
But how is this theoretical concept applied as a tool for financial extraction? I mean, how does semantic capture differ from what we normally think of as political corruption? We've talked on this show before about state capture, where billionaires just bribe politicians to pass laws.
That is a vital distinction to make.
Yeah.
Economic state capture is when an oligarch bribes a judge to get a favorable ruling in a specific court case, or when a corporation pays off a legislature to write a specific tax loophole into a bill just for them.
Right.
It is the private purchase of the rules. You are paying the referee to look the other way. Semantic capture operates on a much deeper, more insidious level. It does not just bend the rules. It appropriates the very vocabulary we use to judge whether the rules are fair in the first place.
I am trying to visualize this. If economic state capture is bribing the referee during a soccer game so your team wins,
Yes.
semantic capture is stealing the official rulebook, completely rewriting what constitutes a foul or a goal, convincing the entire stadium that your new forged rulebook is the only valid one, and then playing the game.
That is brilliant.
You don't need to bribe the referee anymore because you own the definition of the game itself.
That is an excellent visualization. Semantic capture buys the conceptual frame within which the very desirability of rule following is articulated. The regime retains the name of the good. They still loudly proclaim they are a democracy, and that name continues to deliver a massive legitimacy premium.
Okay.
The domestic public and the international community hear the word, see the superficial structures, and assume a baseline level of normalcy. But the substance of the concept, the actual accountability and representation, has been completely hollowed out and detached from the practices it ostensibly governs.
It is literal linguistic counterfeiting. If you are a criminal syndicate, printing fake $100 bills is a way to steal purchasing power from the economy. These regimes are forging the concept of democracy itself to steal political power and wealth.
And if we look at the cost-benefit analysis for our defective stationary bandit, this strategy is brilliantly logical. Imagine you are the extractive elite. You have three options for legitimation.
Okay, let's hear.
Option one, you provide genuine democracy and a genuinely impartial rule of law. What is the immediate consequence?
Well, a genuine democracy will vote you out of office for being corrupt, and a genuine rule of law will immediately prosecute you and put you in a prison cell for stealing the country's wealth. It completely destroys your ability to extract rents. That option is fatal to the elite.
Exactly. Option two, you nakedly abandon the vocabulary. You stand up and honestly declare, we're a kleptocratic dictatorship. We do not care about democracy or the law. We are here to steal. What happens then?
That is also ruinous. The domestic public will immediately revolt because you have stripped away any illusion of representation, forcing them to fight, and the international community will hit you with crippling sanctions, freeze your offshore bank accounts, and cut off all foreign aid. You lose all legitimacy and invite immense costs.
Which leaves option three, the counterfeit. You retain the noble names, but you detach the substance. You commission a beautifully written constitution. You establish a gleaming new constitutional court. You hold regular, highly publicized elections.
Okay.
It is relatively cheap, financially speaking, to produce these procedural markers. But because they are counterfeit, because you control their operative meaning, they do not actually constrain your ability to extract wealth.
But they still buy you the legitimacy.
Exactly. And yet, they capture nearly the full legitimacy premium, because observers read these procedural markers as evidence that the underlying goods exist.
It is the optimal, low-cost legitimation strategy. It is brilliant and it is terrifying. So let's look at how this linguistic counterfeiting actually operates on the ground in daily life.
Let's do it.
The authors outline two specific channels where this mechanism lowers the cost of extraction: defeating the domestic public and tricking the external international community. Let's start with the domestic channel. How exactly does semantic capture disarm a country's own citizens?
It disarms them by monopolizing the language of resistance.
How so?
Think about the dilemma facing a dissident in this system. If the regime completely owns the operative definition of democracy and the rule of law, the opposition is left with no vocabulary to articulate their grievances.
Oh, I see.
If you go out into the street with a megaphone and demand real democracy, you are inadvertently reinforcing the regime's framing. You are implicitly conceding that the current system is at least a type of democracy, just perhaps a flawed or immature one.
Yeah.
If you take your grievance about a stolen election to the regime's captured courts and invoke the rule of law, you are arguing on a playing field whose dimensions and rules the regime has already set.
You are forced to fight them using their own forged currency. It blunts the dissent at the very source. It traps you in their paradigm.
Yes. And the authors connect this linguistic trap to some profoundly insightful theories regarding how populations comply with authoritarianism. They invoke Václav Havel's famous essay, The Power of the Powerless.
Oh, Havel's story of the greengrocer. This
Yeah.
is one of the most powerful political allegories of the 20th century. Walk us through what Havel describes here.
Havel asks us to imagine an ordinary greengrocer living in a communist totalitarian state. Every single morning when he opens his shop, among the displays of onions and carrots, he places a small sign in the shop window that reads, "Workers of the world, unite."
Okay.
Now, Havel asks, does the greengrocer actually believe in the global proletariat revolution? Is he a passionate Marxist ideologue?
Almost certainly not. He just wants to sell his vegetables in peace.
He puts the sign up, because every other shopkeeper puts the sign up.
Yeah.
He knows that if he refuses, if he leaves the window blank, he will be questioned by the authorities. The secret police might visit, he might lose his license to run the shop, his children might suddenly be denied entry to the university.
So it's about survival.
Putting up the sign is not a statement of belief, it is a signal of compliance. It is a ritual of obedience. Havel calls this living within a lie. The population sustains the oppressive order not out of genuine belief in the regime's ideology, but by acting as if they believe it simply to survive the day.
The regime does not actually need you to love them. They don't even need you to believe their lies. They just need you to perform the public ritual of obedience so that the illusion of total control is maintained.
And this dynamic was modeled formally by Timur Kuran as preference falsification.
Meaning people are actively lying about their true preferences under the weight of social pressure.
Yes. If you live in a society where speaking out against the extractive elite is dangerous or economically ruinous, You will publicly declare support for the regime while privately despising it.
Right.
The terrifying consequence of systemic preference falsification is the profound social isolation it creates. No one knows what anyone else actually believes. You look out your window, you see everyone else putting the regime sign in their shop, and you think, I must be the only one who hates this system.
So you just stay quiet.
Exactly. Public opinion diverges incredibly far from private conviction. The regime appears monolithic and completely stable. Right up until the moment a spark hits, the fear breaks, and a sudden cascade reveals that the public support was completely hollow all along.
So semantic capture is the regime's primary tool for maintaining this preference falsification. By monopolizing the legitimate vocabulary, they make it incredibly costly and confusing to voice genuine dissent. They make it look like everyone is basically fine with the status quo.
That is the internal disarmament. Now, what about the external channel?
Right. How do they handle the international community, Western democracies, the international donors, the World Bank, the NGOs? Because an observer from the United Nations or a foreign diplomat isn't living under the threat of the local secret police. They can afford to be critical. They aren't forced to put the sign in the window.
True, but international observers face a massive information asymmetry. They cannot easily measure the true substance of governance in a foreign country. You can't just stick a thermometer into a society and get a readout of its democracy level or its rule of law purity.
So what do they do?
Well, what do these massive international bureaucracies do? They rely on verifiable procedural markers. They look at the form. Is there a written constitution guaranteeing human rights? Check. Is there an independent constitutional court on paper? Check. Did they hold an election on Tuesday? Check. Were there multiple political parties on the ballot? Check.
The observers are grading the test based entirely on the formatting, not the actual content of the essays. As long as the margins are an inch wide and the font is Times New Roman, they give it a passing grade.
And authoritarian regimes have learned exactly how to exploit this checklist. The authors reference Andreas Schedler's concept of the menu of manipulation.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Schedler cataloged the highly sophisticated ways regimes stage elections that easily pass the superficial observer's test, while completely denying any actual democratic choice to the voters.
Let's expand on this because it's crucial. How do they do it? Walk us through some items on this menu of manipulation. How do you rig an election without looking like you rigged an election?
You realize very quickly that stuffing ballot boxes on election day is an amateur's game.
Right, too obvious.
It's messy, it leaves physical evidence, and foreign observers standing in the polling station might catch you. Instead, you manipulate the pre-electoral environment months in advance.
Okay. How?
For example, you weaponize the legal code. You write incredibly complex, contradictory registration laws for political candidates, ensuring that your strongest opposition rival is disqualified on a fabricated technicality before their name ever reaches a ballot.
Or you manipulate the media landscape, right?
Absolutely. You don't need to ban opposition speech outright. You just ensure that the state-owned television networks, or the networks owned by allied oligarchs, give 95% of their favorable coverage to the incumbent.
While still giving the opposition some airtime.
Exactly. The opposition might get 5%, usually framed negatively, which allows the regime to claim, look, we have a free press, we allow opposition voices.
And what about the use of state resources? Does that factor in?
Oh, the abuse of administrative resources is a massive tool. Imagine you are a factory manager in a provincial town, and your factory relies heavily on state subsidies to stay afloat.
Okay.
The regional governor calls you and says, your district needs to deliver 5,000 votes for the ruling party, or we are cutting your subsidies next year.
Wow.
You then go to your thousands of employees and make it very clear that if the ruling party loses, the factory closes, and they all lose their livelihoods. You aren't forcing them at gunpoint to vote a certain way, but you have fundamentally coerced the outcome.
Yeah, they have no choice.
Or the state tax authority suddenly launches crippling, endless audits on any mid-level business owner who dares to donate money to an opposition campaign, bankrupting them.
So by the time Election Day actually arrives, the voting process itself might be perfectly clean. The ballots are cast in secret, the counting is entirely accurate, the international observers sign off on their clipboards saying free and fair, but the entire system was structurally rigged 6 months before a single vote was cast. The observers validate the counterfeit.
Yes, the counterfeit arbitrages this exact gap. It ruthlessly exploits the asymmetry between what international observers can empirically verify, the procedural form, and what they cannot easily verify, the underlying coercive substance of power.
This leads to an incredibly powerful synthesis in the text. The authors are essentially arguing that the regime runs two parallel ledgers.
The double ledger. This concept really ties the entire mechanism together.
Let's break this double ledger down. First, there is the de jure ledger, the on-paper reality.
Right.
This is the world of the Constitution, the legal guarantees, the newly established anti-corruption bureaus, the press freedom statutes. In this ledger, if you just read the documents, the country looks like a modern, thriving European democracy.
And then there is the de facto ledger, the actual lived reality on the ground. This is the world governed by the defective stationary bandit.
The messy reality.
This is the world of asset-specific rents, monopolized choke points, patronal pluralism, and the systemic abuse of administrative resources.
And the space between those two ledgers, the vast glaring gap between the beautiful illusion on paper and the extractive, corrupt reality on the ground, the authors call that the rent margin.
The rent margin. That term is the key to the whole paper. It is the surplus wealth, the massive extra financial value that the elite gets to steal because the counterfeit vocabulary shields them.
Because if they didn't have it,
If they did not have the counterfeit vocabulary, the domestic public would revolt and the international community would sanction them. Those actions would impose massive costs and wipe out their profits. The fake democracy, the forged vocabulary, is the protective shell that allows the extraction machine to run at maximum efficiency and profitability.
okay, this is an incredibly dense, profound theoretical framework. We've talked about bandits, collective action, semantic capture, and double ledgers. But to truly grasp how this functions, we need to bring it down to earth.
Let's do that.
We need to look at the empirical illustration provided by the authors. Ukraine from 1991 to 2026.
Yes. The text uses Ukraine as an interpretive illustration. They are not presenting Ukraine as some bizarre outlier, but rather as a theoretically rich, informative, single case that clearly and historically displays all the mechanisms we have just discussed.
And again, a quick reminder for you listening, we are looking at this strictly as a theoretical exercise based on the text. We are impartially analyzing the structural mechanics the authors present, examining how these concepts manifested in a specific historical context.
So to apply the framework to Ukraine, the authors start at the very birth of the modern state. They argue that for semantic capture to take root, there has to be a void.
A void? What kind of void?
The general public cannot have true authorship over their own government. The authors call this the founding deficit, and they argue Ukraine's post-Soviet emergence perfectly matches this requirement.
Explain that founding deficit. What exactly happened during the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991?
In December 1991, Ukraine held a massive, unambiguous national referendum where the population overwhelmingly voted for independence from the Soviet Union. It was a clear, undeniable act of popular will.
Okay.
However, the authors point out a crucial structural distinction. It was a vote for independence, a vote on whether the state should exist. It was not a vote on how that new state would be governed internally.
Ah, I see.
It answered the question, should we be a country? But it did not answer the question, who holds the power and what are the rules?
So it wasn't a constitutional convention where the people sat down to draft their own social contract.
Exactly. And the consequences of that were profound. When the foundational Ukrainian constitution was finally adopted in 1996, it was not authored by a constituent assembly representing the broader public, nor was it ratified by a public referendum.
Who wrote it then?
It was adopted internally by the Verkhovna Rada, the national parliament.
I want to make sure I understand the distinction you're making here because it sounds a bit academic. What is the difference between the public writing the Constitution versus the parliament writing it?
Think of it like a complex board game.
Okay.
The people actively playing the game, making moves within the established rules, are the constituted power. The politicians in parliament are constituted power. They exist because the rules say they exist. But the people who originally sat down and wrote the rule book, who decided how the game works in the first place, are the constituent power.
Right.
In a true democracy, the public is the constituent power. In 1991, the Ukrainian public voted to play the game of independence, but the politicians in parliament were the ones who secretly went into a back room and wrote the rule book themselves.
They wrote the rules for how power would be distributed, and surprise, surprise, they wrote rules that benefited themselves.
Yes. Now, Article 5 of that 1996 Constitution explicitly names the people as the sole source of state power. But the people themselves didn't author the document that named them. So there was an immediate structural gap between titular sovereignty, sovereignty in name only, and effective, on-the-ground sovereignty. This founding deficit created the exact void into which semantic capture could move.
Because if the public didn't write the rule book, the elites who did write it get to dictate what the rules actually mean. The elites get to define democracy.
Precisely.
So who were these elites in the 1990s? Who was in that back room writing the rules? Where did they come from?
The transition literature refers to this phenomenon as elite reproduction. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't a sudden influx of democratic idealists taking over the economy.
No.
The people who ended up with the wealth and the power were largely the exact same people who had it before the collapse. The old Soviet nomenclatura.
The Communist Party functionaries.
The party bosses, the red directors who ran the massive state-owned industrial factories, and the upper echelons of the security apparatus.
So they basically just threw away their Communist Party pins, put on designer suits, and started calling themselves capitalists.
Essentially, yes. During the chaotic privatization processes of the 1990s, they leveraged their insider access, their existing administrative positions, and manipulated voucher schemes to convert public, state-owned property into massive private wealth.
And that's how they became the oligarchs.
Yes, they formed those tightly organized financial industrial groups we talked about earlier. They became the distributional coalitions anchored to specific assets, metallurgy plants, gas transit networks, sprawling media empires.
They transformed themselves into the defective stationary bandits.
And they built the state structure to serve that exact purpose.
So how does this defect, this semantic capture, become visible in the daily life of the country during this period, according to the text? How do we see the counterfeit in action?
The authors argue it is clearly observable structurally. You look at the systemic asymmetry in how the country operates.
What do you mean by asymmetry?
On the one hand, you have highly contested elections. Power does change hands. It is not a monolithic, single-party autocracy. Presidents lose elections. But simultaneously, you have massive systemic asymmetries in the pre-electoral environment. This is what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism.
This goes back to the menu of manipulation we discussed. The game is played, but the playing field is tilted at a 45-degree angle.
Exactly. You have oligarchic control over nearly all the major television networks. You have the highly instrumental use of the courts. The rule of law is invoked constantly in political speeches, but the judiciary is frequently used as a targeted weapon to punish political rivals, protect oligarchic business interests, or raid competitors' companies.
The authors also mention something fascinating about the media landscape in this context. They talk about the agenda-setting capacity of concentrated media ownership. How does that serve the extraction machine?
If a few allied financial industrial groups own all the major television channels, they don't necessarily have to resort to crude brainwashing. They don't have to convince the public that corruption is good.
What do they do instead?
They just have to manage relevance. They dictate what the public spends its time talking about.
So instead of the evening news leading with a deep investigative report into who secretly owns the state energy monopolies or why the country's wealth is hemorrhaging offshore, the news focuses entirely on highly emotional, divisive cultural issues.
Precisely. They focus public anger and political debate almost exclusively on questions of identity, language laws, historical symbols, and geopolitical orientation.
Right.
Now, these are real, deeply felt issues for the population. But structurally, amplifying them, 247, serves to displace the core economic question. It diverts the public's attention completely away from the rent margin and the asset stripping.
It's a misdirection trick. It is like a pickpocket on a crowded street. The pickpocket bumps into you and spills a cup of coffee on your shirt. While you are intensely focused on the stain, yelling about the coffee, his other hand is quietly slipping your wallet out of your pocket. The media monopolies create the coffee stain to distract from the theft of the state.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And this brings us to the central, visible prediction of the framework. Because the system is run by competing factions whose wealth relies on specific assets, you see a profound systemic asymmetry in the provision of state goods.
The text highlights the coexistence of a lavish provision of symbolic goods paired with a massive chronic deficit of substantive public goods.
Yes. The regime produces the symbolic goods in absolute abundance. They produce thousands of pages of new constitutional rights, incredibly complex anti-corruption legislation, massive electoral rituals, and soaring legal rhetoric from politicians.
Because it's cheap.
It is very cheap to produce paper, and it pays the international legitimacy premium. But the substantive, long-horizon public goods that actually improve the lives of the citizens, a genuinely impartial justice system that prosecutes the elite, a level economic playing field for small businesses, reliable broad-based infrastructure, are chronically starved of resources.
Because providing those substantive goods would actively constrain the elite's ability to extract wealth. If the courts actually worked, the oligarchs would be in jail. The asymmetry proves the intent.
That is the core argument the authors present regarding the Ukrainian context between 1991 and the early 2020s.
But if this system is so perfectly designed, if the counterfeit vocabulary is so effective at keeping the elites rich and keeping the public suppressed and disorganized, is it invincible? Are populations living under defective stationary bandits just doomed to be exploited forever?
Not necessarily.
The authors argue no, right? And to explain why, we have to look at the alternative explanations and the boundaries of this theory.
This is a crucial part of any rigorous academic exercise. The authors cannot just present a theory. They have to confront the strongest competing arguments. They have to ask, what if our theory of semantic capture is simply wrong? What are the other more conventional ways political scientists explain this gap between the vocabulary of democracy and the reality on the ground?
Okay, let's play devil's advocate. Let's start with the first major counterargument the authors address. The transition lag theory. We mentioned this at the very beginning of the deep dive. This is the idea that maybe these countries aren't running a calculated counterfeit at all. Maybe they are genuinely trying to become Western-style democracies, but it is just incredibly difficult. They're immature democracies, and they just need more time. Why do the authors argue that this is wrong?
The authors refute the transition lag argument by simply looking at the timeline. This gap between rhetoric and reality has persisted for over 3 decades since 1991.
That's a long transition.
Right. If it were truly just immaturity, a sincere but clumsy effort to transition, you would expect to see gradual convergence toward real democracy over 30 years. You would see the gap slowly, incrementally closing as institutions matured and a new generation took over.
But instead, the gap is incredibly stable. It doesn't close.
Exactly. It's a stable equilibrium. The persistence of the divergence and its highly specific functional fit for enriching the elites suggests it's a feature of the system, not a bug. It is not a caterpillar slowly turning into a butterfly. It is a completely different organism that has already reached its final, optimal adult form.
Okay, what about the second counterargument, the weak institutions or state capacity argument? Maybe the politicians genuinely want to provide the rule of law, maybe they want to stop the corruption, but the state capacity is just too weak. They don't have the tax revenue, the trained personnel, or the institutional strength to enforce the laws properly.
The authors readily acknowledge that state incapacity is a real phenomenon and contributes to the problem, but they point back to that crucial asymmetry in goods provision we just discussed.
Okay.
If the state was simply weak and generally incompetent across the board, you would expect to see everything underprovided. You would expect them to be bad at writing laws, bad at organizing nationwide elections, bad at collecting taxes.
But they aren't uniformly incompetent. They're highly effective at very specific things.
Right. It is like a city government claiming they simply do not have the budget or the engineering capacity to fix the massive, dangerous potholes in your neighborhood, while simultaneously designing, funding, and deploying a billion-dollar, state-of-the-art, flawless surveillance network across the entire city.
The priorities are clear.
The state capacity isn't weak, it is just highly selective. The state is incredibly efficient at producing the symbolic goods and staging complex electoral spectacles. But they selectively fail when it comes to the substantive enforcement that would constrain their own power. That selective incapacity proves it is deliberate.
The selectivity reveals the true priority. Okay, the third counterargument, the functionalist conspiracy. This is the critique that this entire theory makes the elites sound like omnipotent comic book villains. Are the authors suggesting there is a smoke-filled room somewhere in the Capitol where 10 oligarchs sit around a mahogany table and explicitly plot out, okay, gentlemen, how do we deploy semantic capture today to forge the concept of democracy?
No, and the authors are extremely careful to avoid that trap. There is no master villain. There is no grand orchestrated conspiracy. It operates as a decentralized, self-reinforcing equilibrium.
Explain how a system this complex works without explicit coordination.
Think about the incentives facing any individual elite actor in this system. If you are a mid-level oligarch, it is completely rational, purely out of your own self-interest, to invest in retaining the legitimate vocabulary of democracy to protect your own specific assets.
Okay, so you just act selfishly.
Yes. So you fund a think tank that promotes the rule of law to legitimize your property claims. You buy a regional TV station to promote your preferred candidates who will protect your business. You hire expensive lawyers to use the courts offensively against your business rivals.
Right.
You do all of this independently to protect your own slice of the pie. But when every single elite actor in the country is doing the exact same thing independently, the aggregate macro result is the systemic counterfeit.
Oh, wow.
It is the invisible hand of autocracy at work. It doesn't require a conspiracy, it just requires everyone acting rationally within a broken, extractive incentive structure.
That makes it even more insidious. Honestly, you can't just arrest one corrupt mastermind and fix the system because the system is the aggregate behavior of everyone in power.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the boundary conditions. For any theory to be scientifically valid, there has to be a way to falsify it.
Yeah.
There has to be a scenario that proves it wrong, or at least shows its limits. And the text points to two massive events in Ukraine's recent history: the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Euromaidan Revolution, or Revolution of Dignity, in 2013 and 2014.
Right.
These were episodes of massive popular mobilization where millions of people took to the streets, braving freezing temperatures and eventually sniper fire to overthrow the government. Do these revolutions prove that the elite's control isn't absolute? Doesn't it disprove the idea of a passive, disorganized public trapped by preference falsification?
It is a vital question. The authors argue that these mass mobilizations do not disprove the theory of semantic capture. Rather, they bound it. They establish the limits of the equilibrium.
What does bounding it mean in this context?
It means the equilibrium of semantic capture is highly stable, but it is not unbreakable. Think of it like surface tension on a pond. A water strider insect can walk on the surface indefinitely because the tension holds its weight. But if you drop a heavy rock into the pond, the tension shatters.
What was the rock in these historical moments? What broke the tension?
In 2004, with a brazenly rigged election, and in 2013 was the sudden geopolitical pivot away from Europe, accompanied by extreme police brutality against students, the regime pushed the counterfeit too far.
They got greedy.
Exactly. The gap between the de jure ledger, the promise of rights, and the de facto ledger, the reality of extraction and violence, became so egregious, so undeniable, that the preference falsification completely broke down.
The illusion shattered.
Yes, people realized they were not alone in their anger. And in those extraordinary moments, the public temporarily solved their collective action problem. Millions poured into the squares. And crucially, looking at it through the lens of this paper, they didn't just demand a change in personnel. They actively sought to reclaim the genuine meaning of the captured terms.
They were asserting that democracy and the rule of law are not just empty procedural buzzwords used by elites to pass an observer's test. They were asserting that these concepts are substantive realities, and they were demanding the genuine article, not the counterfeit.
Exactly. These episodes prove that constituent power in Ukraine, the ultimate foundational authority of the people, was displaced by the elites in the 1990s, but it was never truly destroyed. It was lying dormant under the surface.
Waiting for the right moment.
Yes. The revolutions demonstrate that semantic capture can be fiercely contested. The ongoing struggle, the open question for any country in this situation, is whether those intense, episodic moments of mass mobilization can be converted into durable, permanent institutional control by the public.
Which brings us to the ultimate so what of this entire text. We have spent this deep dive unpacking a very dense, profound theoretical framework applied specifically to post-Soviet governance. But what does this mean for how we understand politics globally? Because as the authors note, this mechanism of semantic capture isn't uniquely confined to Ukraine.
Not at all. The authors hypothesize that semantic capture will appear anywhere you have those three core conditions.
Right.
A deficit of constituent power at the founding of the state, an elite that derives its wealth from specific assets rather than broad taxation, and a global environment where democracy is the only acceptable vocabulary for legitimacy.
So it could happen anywhere.
You can apply this lens to dozens of hybrid regimes, competitive authoritarian systems, and backsliding democracies all over the world.
So if you are listening to this right now, how does this apply to your own newsfeed? The journey we've been on today suggests that when you read about a regime somewhere in the world passing a shiny new anti-corruption law, establishing a new constitutional court, or holding an elaborate election, you shouldn't automatically assume it is a sign of a failing, struggling, or immature democracy.
Right.
In these contexts, you have to ask yourself, is this a genuine public good, or is it a highly successful, fully matured technology of extraction? Is it the counterfeit designed to pass the international observer's test while shielding the robbery happening inside the vault?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, The practical implication for anyone showing support genuine democratic reform is profound. In a setting captured by a defective stationary bandit, democratization cannot simply be about building more institutions or writing more laws.
Because if you just fund a new anti-corruption court, the elites will just capture the meaning of that court too. They will just counterfeit the new institution.
Yes, the counterfeit will just expand to simulate the new institutions. The only way out of the equilibrium is for the public to reappropriate the meaning of the concepts themselves. Democratization fundamentally means restoring authorship over the terms in which people are governed. It is the recovery of constituent power.
Until the people control the dictionary, the elites will always control the laws.
That is the tragic yet clarifying reality of semantic capture. The noblest words in the political lexicon, democracy, justice, the rule of law, can become the most efficient instruments of oppression if their meaning is stolen.
It is a dark but incredibly illuminating way to view the world. It fundamentally changes how you parse political rhetoric. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought. We started today by talking about an architect building a deceptive bank vault, an illusion of security. We've spent this time exploring how political elites use counterfeit language as the cheapest, most effective way to control a disorganized public and pass the international test.
Yeah.
But looking ahead, we have to ask ourselves a question that isn't directly answered by our text today, but is entirely inspired by it. In an age of artificial intelligence, algorithmic feeds, deepfakes, and increasingly fragmented, hyper-curated media ecosystems, are we, the public, becoming more equipped to spot the counterfeit?
That's a scary thought.
Or, by living in these polarized digital realities where truth is constantly negotiated, are we actually making it even easier for the bandits to forge the words we live by? If the ultimate prize in politics is capturing the very meaning of reality, you have to ask yourself, who is writing your dictionary?